Welcome to another episode of Risk Unfiltered. My name is Ken Hackshaw. With me today is Lieutenant Colonel Michael Jones. I'm going to ask, and by his insistence, I'll call him Michael. And I'll have Michael introduce himself and exactly what he does. Michael, welcome to Risk Unfiltered, and thank you very much for taking the time, sir.
Thanks very much for having me, Ken. As you indicated, my name is Mike Jones, Barbadian. I am recently appointed Executive Director for CARICOM Implementation Agency for Crime and Security. We're headquartered here in Trinidad and Tobago. We also have an office called the Joint Regional Communications Center that is housed in Barbados. And prior to my appointment as the Executive Director, I was the Chief Operations Officer there. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today.
What is the primary function of impacts? So for those who may not know.
Okay, essentially, well, we were created by way of an intergovernmental agreement signed on the 6th of July 2006. I know that there was a misconception that we were created for the Cricket World Cup hosted here back in 2007. That is actually not the case. It might have been the catalyst for doing so, but there would have been, what you call it, not a think tank, but basically the word comes out in my head now, but 2002, there would have been a study basically where a number, 113 recommendations, I believe there were, that came out of the crime and security study, recommending that in essence, what was needed would have been an agency that does the day-to-day groundwork as it relates to security matters from the heads of government. As you would know or appreciate and practice fortuitous at this point in time, Trinidad and Tobago carries the lead in the CARICOM quasi-cabinet for both energy and security matters. Currently, Dr. Keith Rowley is the chairman of CARICOM, and that typically has a chairmanship every 6 months on an alphabetical order. So in July, another head would take over. But what was recognized is that between the meetings, typically in February and July, you needed to have an entity that was primarily or specifically focused to do the groundwork of those initiatives or those mandates that would have been given from the heads as it relates to security matters. And in essence, given the huge security undertaking that would have been required for the hosting the Cricket World Cup 2007, even though the recommendations were made since 2002, impacts came into being, and we have been an entity ever since.
Okay, great. That's good information. What islands of the Caribbean? What islands that make up the Caribbean may not or does not form part of or does not fall under the purview or the remit of impacts, if any?
Well, like I said, the intergovernmental agreement would have been signed by the 15 member states.
Okay.
There are 5 associate members, which are the 5 British overseas territories, with the exception of Montserrat. Okay. So those essentially would be the 20 islands constituents. I did know that you made the differentiation between CARICOM and Caribbean. So there are a number of islands. So for example, if you take St. Lucia, which is in the middle between Martinique and Guadeloupe and so on, we recognize that there are other geographical interests. So you have both the French, you have the Dutch with Aruba, Bonaire, St. Martin, etc. In essence, one of the things that we undertook as a strategic initiative is to ensure that we have functional relationships with all of our neighbors, whether they are members of CARICOM or not.
Right. Yeah. And so, and I had one island state in mind, Bahamas. Where do they fall, as a member or?
No, they are a member. So from as far up as northwest, that is Belize and Bahamas, down to southeast in Suriname and Guyana. And I guess that now you mentioned that when people speak about the Caribbean, sometimes you hear of the concentric circles in the sense that you look predominantly at the archipelago states that comprise the Windward and the Leeward Islands, so to speak, Barbados being just outside. Sometimes you get the criticism that because they are so northerly, that people tend not to consider them, or they not consider themselves part of the CARICOM cluster, but they're very much part and parcel of our grouping.
Okay, so and hence the distinction between CARICOM and Caribbean. So there are Caribbean states that are member states to impacts, but they fall outside of the CARICOM conglomerate, if I could use that word.
Say that again. Okay. So we do have a number of continental states,
right?
Or whereas they're not islands within the Caribbean Sea, they are. So your Guyanas, your Surinams in South America,
right?
Your Belize in Central America,
right?
Bahamas itself, an island chain, but rather northerly. There are two members of CARICOM. Okay.
All right. Okay. Education, great. So let's take that into the conversation around border security, yeah, and let's segue into why you are quarantined in Trinidad right now because of COVID. What role is Impact has played and continues to play in assisting governments in treating with COVID-19?
All right. If we can rewind as far back now, COVID-19 is it today? Well, since March 10th, I believe, when it would have been declared a global pandemic,
right? Until
now. But prior to that, if you go back to 2013, in October, I believe, we were also running scared then about Ebola.
Right.
If I have my calculations correct.
Yeah.
And if I go to February of that same year, 2013, we would have gotten approval at heads of government meeting in Haiti of that year for the CARICOM crime and security strategy. And within that strategy, there were a number of threats and risks that were identified, divided into 4 different tiers or categories. And in category 4, it speaks to emerging threats. 3 things were highlighted there: climate change, mass migration, and pandemics. We've later learned that pandemics was probably not the best word or nomenclature to use, but public health emergencies of international concern. That was approved. It's a long answer, but again, to your point.
Right.
And I think it's important because, like I said, these things or threats are going to evolve over time. So public health emergencies of international concern was identified in category 4 as things that we need to look out on the horizon for. And no sooner than that being approved in February that we had issues with Ebola in October. And since 2013 until 10th of March last year, I believe there were 5 public health emergencies of international concern, 2 instances of Ebola. You have the COVID that rose to the level of a global pandemic. You had Zika and so on and so forth.
Right.
Now, I thought that was important because it's COVID. It was Ebola yesterday. It's COVID today. God knows what is going to be year, and I do hope that we get a break next year. But as it relates to the role and function that we serve, one of the things would be we manage on behalf of all of the CARICOM member states a regional border security mechanism called the Advanced Passenger Information System.
Right.
So whether it is Belize in the northwest again, or Suriname down south, all 15 and 2 of the associate members being Turks and Caicos Islands, as well as Cayman Islands, we all were on a common platform for submission of API or advanced passenger information. So in essence, all of the member states would have passed legislation by amending their immigration acts for the requirement for anything that flies or anything that sails to submit that information on board to us at CARICOM Impacts, where it is then scrubbed against a number of databases. So as we are speaking specifically as it relates to COVID and any other such public health emergencies, essentially what we can do in the system is to put flags where we can identify persons that may be flying from a high-risk region. So as in the days of Ebola, when persons were flying from West Africa, as in the case from COVID-19 when it first started, we would have been able to identify persons that would have been coming up from Wuhan, China to any of the member states, and then say to the immigration authorities, that might be receiving them, where, hey, Ken Hackshaw is on board flight ABC 123 coming in from wherever. There is an outbreak of whatever the risk is at that point in time. We are requesting then that you take a look at the passenger, whether, to see if they are exhibiting any signs, or if it is one of a criminal nature, to search your luggage and that sort of thing. But that is one of the primary roles that we were doing on behalf of the member states, particularly in relation in assistance to CARFA, which is the Caribbean Public Health Agency, which would take the primary lead in this regard, given that is a public health pandemic.
Okay, and that's good information. So I would imagine then that your organization will work across not only when things go bad, i.e. COVID, but to prevent things from going bad. Yeah, so we can use the word, and so there's, we oftentimes refer to Caribbean institutions as being more reactive than proactive. So there's the term, and this is Ken Hackshaw speaking by way of experience in working with some of these institutions, that many of our critical infrastructures managed by failure, i.e. things go bad, we fix it or we treat with it. So let's bring some of what has happened in the outside world back into the Caribbean, and then you could speak to how does Impact take and view what has happened in the outside world, and can it impact Caribbean entities or Caribbean states? So a couple of days ago, there was a hacking of Colonial Pipeline, a major distribution pipeline for oil and gas. And even as we speak here in southern Florida, there are a few lines to get gasoline for your vehicle. So having that manifested, or having that risk eventuate as it did, and knowing that there are similar structures across the Caribbean, or internal to certain Caribbean states, and even across Caribbean states, what does Impact do, or how does Impact then take that which has happened and incorporate that into its daily processes, or in assisting institutions and countries to manage their risk? And I guess now, given the example I'm speaking about, we're talking cybersecurity. Yeah. So, but specific to that example, as Impact, the organization that you head, have said, okay, guys, this has happened. What can we do here? How can we be proactive and anticipatory in our workspace? And if nothing has been done like that, then that's a conversational topic we'll go along. But and I think you know where I'm going, because my next question will be, okay, what part of Impacts, by way of department, unit, or person, does that capture and assessment? So let's start with that.
Compounded question.
Yeah.
Well, before you got to the hacking, you were basically speaking to the approaches to risk, and Well, you ended up with a specific example
Yeah.
of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
It is, so you made reference to the hacking of the pipeline in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
America, which is a federal system. And it made specific mention of that because though we have a Caribbean community of 15 member states, for all intents and purposes, there's no internationalization across the board. So even when decisions are taken at the heads of government, it then has to filter down individually.
Right. Yeah.
To be done in that regard. So that's one.
And also, Michael, the converse is also true. There could be there could be decisions at the individual state level that can impact other member states. Yeah, and so a good example could be Trinidad and Tobago being an energy producer, and the products and byproducts are then sold to or given to other member states. So if Trinidad and Tobago is impacted in that regard, then other member states are impacted. So it goes both ways, right?
No, I agreed. So for example, if you're using that one, if you're talking about, let's say, our approaches to plastic or renewable energies, whereas you have Trinidad and now, well, not belatedly, but in more recent times, Ghana being in state, you're not necessarily going to see, that transition to green energy, being accepted,
right?
Easy transition to in those two as with the others. So, whereas as a community, we would, may make a collective agreement at one level. One then has to recognize the nuanced differences between us, whether it is by way of our generic sources that build up our economies. You even have to look in things of size. When you put, for example, if you were to juxtapose Montserrat next to Haiti, you're talking 12 million people as opposed to 5,000 people, sorry. But in essence, one country, one vote, irrespective of size, irrespective of geography, irrespective of economies and that sort of business. So you are right. There are nuanced differences that would make it somewhat difficult, given that it is not a federal construct within CARICOM that says, well, once a decision is taken at that level, then it permeates across the board through.
Okay, so let's do this. Let's make it. Let's simplify the example. So, what role does impact play, or can impact play a role in helping to ensure that if something bad happens in one island, that there is not a ricochet effect or a cascading effect across the member states?
No, agreed.
How is that identified?
Sorry, and again to that, it'll probably take too long to get to some of
you take your time. You take your time.
I like being thorough. But again, one of the advantages, of doing things collectively is that you then get that macro approach that is not available or possible by doing things in silos or individually. So I would give you one example. I recall back in 2015, there was the pending elections to come. It was anticipated that you would have had pending elections, the United States. You were just coming off the end of a two-term Obama, and it looked a surety that Hillary Clinton would have won. The thought back then was, with the warming of relations between Cuba and the United States, that you will probably see the disappearance of the one wet foot, one dry foot rule. So you started to see a number of Cubans departing Cuba, and you're seeing them leaving officially and coming into our member states area, particularly on the northern side. But then somehow you don't see when they leave. But again, because of our partnerships and so on with the US, Interpol, and others, a name. So I see Ken leaving Cuba to come in. I pull Antigua because A is the first letter in the alphabet.
Right.
But, you know, so I can see Ken leaving Cuba to go to Antigua, for example. But then I don't see any reference of him leaving, or whether it is Puerto Rico or USVI. But basically, what you're then seeing is, or you will get notice that, that Ken has shown up in one of the territories claiming claiming asylum, sorry. So when you pick up that trend and you say, well, okay, we've noticed this, are complaining, so to speak, keep a keen eye out sort of thing. And from the time you mention that to, let's say, A for Antigua, you can basically see it coming down the chain, so to speak, to a point where it didn't make no sense because of the distance. They went from A all the way down to, let's say, S, for example, in Suriname or Guyana, and then they start making their way by land to the US-Mexico border. The point is you would not recognize those things unless you were doing it or operating at a macro level. That's one. Two, your initial example was one of a cybersecurity example. Mm-hmm. And 2016, I believe, we would have written a cybersecurity and cybercrime action plan for the CARICOM member states. And one caveat I would need to place here is that I think there are about 18 or so regional institutions, and in some instances, or in many instances, a lot of the work would overlap. And what we try to do, certainly under my time of leadership, is not to be duplicating things, or I know this is not the origin for it, but not to have a Me Too type mentality, mm-hmm. but to work along with our partners and see, well, okay, if the RSS has a digital and forensics lab, I am not going to look for monies as well for a digital forensics lab. I will focus my interests or concerns or energies on assisting member states in developing their legislation, training judges and that sort of thing, how to deal with digital evidence and understanding all of the things that I don't even understand myself. But the point I'm trying to make here is to recognize that there are other partners. And again, using the example that you would have cited, you had the CTU, the Caribbean Telecommunications Union, that would also play a role in these things here too as well. Because recognizing and going back to where you started, the approach to risks that some of our member states take may be because one, the theory tells us in dealing with difficult or wicked problems, one of the attitudes basically adopt the posture of an ostrich and put your head in the sand and hope that it, because they always morph, so hope it changes. Two, all of our member states are severely hampered as it relates to financing, and it is easier to get capital financing to deal with things when they break, as opposed to having a good routine maintenance program ongoing. I mean, it is unfortunate.
That's the first time that I've heard it and articulated like that. And you're correct though, that it's easier to get financing to fix something than it is to prevent that thing from being broken. And that is the reality. But let's rather than to prevent it. So let me challenge you with something, Michael. And again, you're spot on with what you have just said and how some entities view it, and that's reality. So staying with the cybersecurity, staying with the example of the pipeline. Let's forget cybersecurity for a second. Let's talk about risk to critical infrastructure. Yeah, and knowing, and you much better than I do, that many of these islands have intersections, interconnectivity. That if one fails, there's going to be failure at some of the other Caribbean states. Yeah, or there's going to be impact. Yeah, of one kind or the other. So let me try this as an example. So you're in Trinidad now. Trinidad is an oil energy producer. Ghana is on the upswing. I would imagine, I haven't looked at the statistics recently, but many of the CARICOM states would receive their petroleum products from Trinidad and Tobago. If Trinidad and Tobago is impacted, then that impact will be felt across some of the Caribbean states. Is there interest from impact, or does impact have this 30,000 feet level view as to how critical entities businesses run, so that if there is failure, it does not impact other Caribbean states? So whether it's energy or electricity or not necessarily water, and again, using Trinidad and Tobago as an example, and the energy sector. If there's impact to the energy sector of Trinidad and Tobago, there'll be impact to other Caribbean states. Does impact have some sway or receive data that demonstrates how effective a critical energy supplier is running or treating with their risks?
In that specific example, no. We do threat assessments for member states, for organizations. So
if called upon.
If called upon.
If you aren't, then you would not know.
Agreed. But there is, so, I mean, if you go back to the same crime and security strategy, right. Attacks on critical infrastructure was something that was identified. Right. And the thing about it is, let us delete the word attack on critical, delete the word attack and just look at critical infrastructure, because the infrastructure itself is not necessarily going to be physical plants, but can also be systems.
Yes.
So it disrupted and as a consequence, we learned from that, in that, people saying you can't put all your eggs in one basket. So while it would be, for example, good and that we circulate our monies amongst ourselves and not necessarily prop up somebody else's economies, we would have to look at things like supply and demand, being able to, the speed to market and those sort of things, and creating other routes so that in instances of emergency, you're not being told, well, you're not one of my traditional customers, so you're relegated to an also ran kind of thing. But your initial question, well, we have done the generic broad scope threat assessments and so on, unless called upon to do so, to look at a particular, no, we haven't done it.
Would you like to be able to do that? Meaning, part of your remit should be, Ken Hackshaw is asking, if impacts would love to be able to interrogate processes and systems of any, and I'm using the word critical infrastructure of all member states. Would that be a nice to have?
That would be a nice to have. Yes, you can, but if you're talking about critical infrastructure, if you're talking about trafficking in persons, as opposed to smuggling of people or even organs. If you're talking about guns, if you're talking about chemicals, the point is, if you go back to the same strategy I keep mentioning, there are going to be, I think also 14 different risks that were identified. The long and short of it is that there is a lot of work to be done. And there are only so many hands and resources to do it.
Good. So I like where the conversation is going. Hence,
no, but if you wanted to get there, let's go. But the point is, and I'm sure it is not the same, is not different for me or anybody, whether it's regional or nationally. There is plenty of work, but few hands and resources to get it done.
I agree. So that it's a nice little segue. Hence the reason why these things are scripted, right? So that's where the role of risk management comes in, because it comes down to this: identifying the probability of an event happening, and then
there is your key word,
right? Exactly, and then assessing an impact. So if you said if you have 1,000 things that can go wrong, right? Right, and you have limited resources by way of finance or people. I'm sure that's happening impacts. But then you look at and then I will ask you the question. You said, I think you quantified the number of risks, and then my next question would be, well, how do you define what exactly constitutes a risk in the eyes of impact? Well, we'll come to that in a second. So speaking to the value of risk management, or enterprise risk management, you have all of these probabilities, which is what you probably have listed. But if you do like an impact analysis of each of them, it's going to be, maybe out of that 1,000, 15 of them are of high impact. So we need to focus there, right? That does not mean that the others can't eventuate, because you have those low probability, high impact. So you can't take your eye off of those, but you do have to then dedicate, your main assets behind the high probability, high impact events. So it comes down to two things in my respectful view. Nice little segment. How does impact under your leadership integrate formal risk management into its decision-making processes? And the answer could be it does not, or you use certain elements of it, right? But this is the question, because if you're talking probability and impact, then within impacts you would have to do risk assessments of your member states, either via critical infrastructure, be tech, water, electricity, energy, trafficking. So maybe something that impact can consider is building in or integrating a formal structural risk management framework into your role as to identifying the probabilities or risks, doing impact assessments based on those probabilities. And one of the greatest impact can be, I'm not concerned with things that can happen within Trinidad, but there's no impact to other member states. So one of the goals of your impact analysis will be anything that could impact member states. I will focus on those. You have the floor, sir.
So the word you were looking for there just now is commonality. And I was going to throw it back to you.
Or shared risk. Let's use the word shared risks. Staying with the risk management team. If you're more comfortable with commonality, we could use that.
Shared risk can work, but I don't think it denotes of what commonality, certainly am I thinking. And the question I was going to throw back at you, one thing that all of these CARICOM countries have in common as a major or priority security concern. And
water security by way of water, I would probably say.
Firearms.
Firearms, okay, yeah.
Ask any commissioner, any politician, because at the end of the day, it also has effects into other
criminal activity
areas. So if I had a chance, invest in any of the CARICOM member states, yes, you're going to look at things like critical infrastructure, ease of doing business, but the security and the cost of doing business is going to factor. No, you were asking basically how we do the risk assessment. Commonality would be one. Two, while an autonomous body, at the end of the day, you don't work for yourself. So you would then have your mandates that are issued by heads of government. And then there is the priority and probability impact that you were mentioning. So all those things then have to be put into the evaluation matrix to see who comes first, second, third, and fourth. And even when we do our evaluation criteria, then the sequencing of execution may not necessarily always work in that prescribed order, because at the end of the day, it needs money to make the mirror fly, as again we say. So if the monies aren't coming from member states' pockets, you have to go to market to source that. It isn't always the case that the IDP or the international development partners, that their priorities or that their sequencing will always match up or align with your sequencing and or timing. So even though that you do your evaluation of quite mandates, commonality, priorities, and probabilities, and impact and that sort of thing, at the end of the day, I also then have to factor in the partnership component. So, all of that being said.
Okay. So let's frame the conversation along this way. Have there been instances where, and I'm sure there is, where impacts have identified, commonalities or probabilities, but it does not align with, so let's make it simple. Are there
I give you one. No, right. I can give you one. And when you hear the term terrorism, and I recall, I don't know how wide a listenership your podcast has, but I remember about 8 years ago, 6-7 years ago, but we wanted to bring this, it's 8 years ago, this terrorism thing to the fore for their consideration. Not necessarily at the heads of government level, but sufficiently high up. You'll get the answer back, like, but why pushing that? That's a Trinidad problem. I'm saying, but no, you can't look at that way, because, or becasing, as your children they say in Barbados, if you have a single market and economy where people are free to move and establish, let us assume that it was only Trinidadians that was involved in this thing. You can't stop a Trinidad from moving. They can now move. Must be given 6 months automatic stay. You got a skill certificate. I have a right to establish. So you can't say it that way. That's one. Two, you have to look at it. I always call it the continuum or the process. Somebody had to be so disenfranchised, frustrated, or to succumb to the radicalization process. Before you get to the radicalization process, let's look at the prevention. So where does that happen? It can happen in prisons, it can happen in schools, it can happen online. And I'm doing this long answer thing again. That security is multidimensional. Because you can have a little 15-year-old zitty face boy that girls don't want to talk to at school. So he feels spurned. He go on the internet, on the dark web or whatever, start reading this crap. How do you know what your child is doing at 11 o'clock on uwwhatever.com? So that prevention component. There is the radicalization component. And you have significant global clerics in other member states. I can name Jamaica. If you look at the attempted bombings at the airport in the US. There was a Guyanese involved too as well.
Right.
If the King's Crossing bombing in London, there was another Jamaican. In matter of fact, I think that boy was 17 or 18 years old or some foolishness like that. So it ain't just Trinis that doing this thing. If you go to the financing part, who moving the money, there are other nationalities involved. And at the height of the exodus of persons leaving to go off to fight with ISIS, I remember one instance in particular where there was a Jamaican national whose ticket was bought by a Barbadian who got stopped moving from Trinidad into Suriname on his way out to go and do what it is that he was doing. So whereas you pointing your finger at Trinidad, it's only you had Barbadians, and by virtue of where he was moving, Trinidad and Suriname involved. So you have to look at this thing holistically.
Yeah.
Talking about a community, it can't be a Trinity problem. It is a community problem.
Okay, so we're going back to that word called commonality. So let's, and I think I'm going to use the word frustration as I would have lived it. So no, the podcast is called Risk Unfiltered. So there are some things we will not have to put a filter on. So Michael, here's the challenge. Unless, and as a security professional, you would know this, and I'll use your training background as an example. If you have folks in an army, in a regiment, they more or less go through the same training. Yeah. So they're exposed to the same training, same reaction one needs to put in place to treat with a particular incident. Yeah. So they're all singing from the same hymn book. Yes. To your point, and I have lived this in doing what I do. It's a challenge for folks. When we talk about risk and compliance, you need buy-in, and it needs to start from the top. If the decision makers doesn't view risks the same way you do, you'll be always what I call at times pissing against the wind. That's the reality, because your view on what, and terrorism, the example you raised there was a good example as well. And I have a mantra that says, if they can't think it, they can't act on it. And so, Michael, I wish I could share with you some real details as to what I'm speaking about. But here's where I want your feedback, or maybe even suggestions. How do you then sell the need for what you do and how you're going to do something to folks who will not see that need? And you do not have the luxury, or maybe, and I hope you don't, that says, okay, I'm not going to bother with that. Because if you're telling them there's a risk of this thing happening, and whatever that thing is, and they are not agreeing, then where are we? And then the potential impact of that thing eventuating is lives lost, or individuals being displaced. Yeah. And hence the reason I ask specifically of impacts. What tools do you have in your toolbox to do that pushing out of that educating of what can be, what lies ahead? So if you have a risk matrix that says these are the things that are happening in the outside world, these are the things that could find its way in the Caribbean, as it has. Cybersecurity is one, because there are assessments across the board, some that has happened already. And many of the institutions on the government agencies are soft targets. So how does impact educate and inform the decision makers? And I would imagine it can't just be showing them a document, because does it fall on your lap or folks close to you that says, okay, we need to educate these guys, or convince them? How does that work for you?
Another complex question. For the most part, the heads of government are very much in tune with the security considerations and so on. So it's not that much of a hard sell at times. I think what would be required for me is to put the pestle analysis on it. And there's a reason why pestle begins with P, because we won't have the experience of a politician.
Right.
But it is to see, because they use another set of criteria to evaluate things that does not normally fall within my schema. But in order to get to yes, to understand and to get that buy-in, you need to put that pestle, the political, what are geopolitics in here? How is this particular administration oriented towards, these things? Shortly under that, there's the economics and so on. So
right.
Anything that you do, a matter of fact, I need to roll back one. Yeah, and speaking truth to power, particularly from the time you get to the head, I think you should always see your own mortality in view, in the sense that you have a responsibility to speak the truth respectfully to your seniors, but it is what it is. So that if it costs you something, at least you would have done your job. But I think that is your job. So that's one. Two, doing the pestle analysis, like I said, to have an appreciation as to what their considerations are, would help me then in framing what it is we put forward to them. And the same way how I do it with, or I expect it from my subordinates, don't come and tell me, sir, we got a problem. Sir, we've identified this as a problem, and these are proposed courses of action that are open to us, but I recommend this one because X, Y, and Z. So the same way how I expect that from below, I have to do the same thing above. I think we need to take a look at this because these are all of the things that can go bad and so on. This is how it's going to impact you. And if you can particularly align it again with their political objectives and moorings, you have a better sell. In terms of prioritizing, other than looking at, so let's say from the needs side, you have the commonality, probability, priorities, and that sort of business. You then have to turn that now onto the domain. In instance, there are 5 or 6, some even people talking about 7, but you have air, land, space that we don't compete in, and cyber.
Right.
As the majority of our member states are islands, with the exception of the 4 I told you about, and so on, and Haiti splitting Hispaniola with Dominican Republic. The only way that anything can get into Trinidad, for example, is by sea or by air. So we need to, and then there's the cyber
element.
So look at those 3. So the maritime domain is a priority area for us for this year and going forward. We're working very closely with the RSS. They have already obtained some funding in developing national maritime strategies for their member states. We are in discussions with an international partner to get some for the other member states as well, have a blessing macro regional maritime strategy, because there is significant resources within our maritime domain and that we need to protect. Matter of fact, as this is Trinidad, we recently had a significant success working with your, what's this called? It's your fishery division. I'm not sure if I used the right term. A young lady by the name of Marika, I'll tell your name shortly. but by using some of the tools and resources that we have, we were able to identify a vessel fishing in your waters that were attracting as much as 250 tons.
Whoa.
Tons of tuna.
Right.
So whether it is extracting fish from your maritime environment, whether it is doing pollution, whether it is, as you mentioned, and I'm not saying this is what's happening, but these are all potential risks being sanctioned all from Venezuela. There's a lot that happens in our maritime environment, and that particular is one where bulk can happen.
Yeah. How does a risk get on your radar? I mean, what triggers are there to say to impacts or to say to Michael?
1,000 Frenchmen can't be wrong. You know, that's not
unless they're colluding.
No. We coordinate standing committee meetings of, there's the correctional facilities or the prisons, the commissioners of police, the chiefs of defense staff, who else is in there? Chiefs of immigration, controllers of customs, and so forth. And typically we have 2 meetings a year of each of those. So let me give you an example. Coming out of the same COVID business, last year, we had an emergency meeting, particularly for the correctional institutions, because prisons were identified as a hotspot where this thing can spread, principally because a lot of our prisons are dense or overcrowded, so to speak. Had that meeting with them. We were then able to identify, well, basically by sharing stories, what the risks were in the different prisons, who had protocols established, because one of the things you would always recognize is that you can have some that are more developed than others, and so on and so forth. And by basically having engagement, we were then able to consolidate what they had amongst themselves, supplement that, and share it across them to help them. We were then able to take those asks to our partners, and in this regard, we got great assistance from the UK High Commission here in Trinidad and Tobago, where we were then able to provide some assistance as it relates to PPEs and sanitizing went to the prisons. There was a second intervention. Most recently, we were able to provide some computers to them that they can do virtual visits between them and their, so that you don't have to come into the prisons, but they can do virtual courts and virtual visits with their families and so on.
What are you most uncomfortable with, given what your role and your functions are? What are you not comfortable with? Or what makes you most uncomfortable? Quiet.
By essence, well, with this, there was some verse in about peace and safety, then sudden destruction. So it's not that you thrive in chaos, but you always want to ensure that you're not missing something, because people say, I hate surprises.
Right.
It's good that you know what you know, but then you also want to know that you don't know everything. But then
that's what it's supposed to be like. But there are some leaders who believe they know everything, right? Because yeah, go ahead.
There's 3 categories. So there's stuff that I know, and what I know I can try and address. I do know that I don't know everything, so I would try to learn and evolve. So, but then the stuff that I don't know, that me is what scares me.
So how does impact intend to ring fence and ring fence is a kind of strong word, but protect the Caribbean islands from that which has not happened yet?
In a number of ways. If you can deal with it before it gets to you.
Well, if you can identify it before it gets to you, good, right?
Exactly. So learning from others, it is, and of course, you're going to have to scale it. So, for example, tomorrow we have a meeting with the Pacific Islands who are looking at have a similar setup to what we do. Again, because their strength in numbers, economies of scale, and that sort of business. So I can learn from them as it relates to, comparable size issues. Then there is the ones that control the market, so to speak, in passing or imposing legislations. So the IATAs, the ICAOs, the IMOs, and so on. There's a reason why that you're asking for this. Then you're doing the scenario plan.
Okay. So there's like 1,000 other questions we could probably go down the road with, but as we say in the risk management space, nothing is infinite. So let me really put you on this spot. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being, top of the class, how risk intelligent is your workforce? And in risk intelligence, I mean in the identification assessment of risks, and risk being uncertainties. I may not be all of them, but some of the average score, because I'm sure you have some administrative folks, but the folks on the front line.
I would give them.
And don't be politically correct here, sir. Good.
No, I always have to be, because invariably as an individual and
but then
on,
you might be creating a risk there. Yeah.
No. I am very well. No. So, like, for example, I find that my operational level, and perhaps is not their role, because again, I always use this analogy, and they would tell you this of an airplane. The airplane is called CARICOM impacts. You have passengers on board, which would be my normal staff, the operational people. Then I have like what you call the cabin crew, which are my managers. The executive team, which sits in the cockpit. So sometimes I would hear, but why are we doing this? Or, I was about to give an example why. But it is because they don't always see, appreciate, or evaluate some of the things that we have to do as an executive.
Right.
So, as they will look at things as black or white. That is, I don't have that luxury. So, typically, if I had to, you said to use an average. Yeah. I will go between 2.5 to 3. But
I think that's a fair.
That is where I would put them. Just pass or just to the right of the middle point.
So again, thank you for this. Keep pushing the agenda, because your work obviously isn't done. And unlike some industries, the livelihood and lives of the Caribbean population is sort of like dependent on what you guys do. Okay.
Yes. Thanks very much for having me, sir.
Thank you, sir. Okay. Cheers.